Can you guys hear me in the back? So we're going to go ahead and get started on the design portion of today's lecture. So okay. So today we're going to be talking about typography and web design. Okay, so before we get started, I'm going to think this is the CSS cheat sheet. So basically this just has like useful selectors and then formatting basics and just like an overall review of like the format and how you code it into CSS. So this is a really useful resource to reference on like projects and assignments. And I believe it's posted on Ed. So if you're interested, you could open that up. And so, okay, back to typography. So why is it important? When you're making a website, you not only want to consider the aesthetic aspects of it, like the color and the graphics, but you also want to consider the type. So most importantly, like the readability and legibility of it. So if you look on the screen, like the last sentence, it's quite difficult to read because of the color contrast and the font choice and the size of the font. So you're going to try to want to avoid this when you're making a website. And we're going to be getting into that today. So just as a reference, type is a beautiful group of letters and not a group of beautiful letters. So we're going to cover that in our slides. Okay, so you can use typography to communicate the character of a website. So for instance, if you look at this example on the screen, this website has a lot of animations and a lot of graphics. So it has a really playful character. And if you look at the typography choice though, it's not extremely playful, but it's not extremely plain either. So it really blends into the entire character of the website, which is kind of what we want. Because if it was extremely playful, it kind of takes away from the animations and it becomes a distraction. So on the other hand, branding is also a thing in design. And basically what that is creating like a theme for color and typography for a brand or like a website. So the goal is that when you're thinking about this brand, you have a very like specific image in mind. So for instance, like Coke, like Coca-Cola Coke, you would probably think like bright red and cursive letters. And that's exactly what they want you to think. So that's like a great example of branding. So that's the goal. So through branding, you can showcase a variety of emotions through type. So often more than 80% of the information on a website is pure text. So that makes it all the more important for you to consider type, the readability and the legibility of the text. So your users are actually gonna want to read through the entire thing, and they're also able to, because if the text is super small or really badly contrasted, then it's really difficult to read through the whole thing. So how do you test the readability of text? You're going to want to consider size, weight, and color of it, which is pretty much what we're going to cover today in the slides. So how do we make typography work? In general, there's two different groups of fonts that we're going to focus on. One of them is serif fonts, which is basically when the letter has a little flick at the end. And in general, it's really classy and formal, and it's used in websites that like have that feeling to them. And an example of this is Times New Roman. So it's actually the default font without CSS. So if you don't specify, everything automatically just shows up as Times New Roman. And on the other hand, we have sans serif fonts, which is basically fonts that do not have the flick. So they feel really modern. And some examples of this is Arial and Carla. So on the right, you could see examples of that. On the left is the sans serif fonts, on the right is the serif fonts. So here in these examples, you can kind of see these fonts put into work. So on the left, it's the serif fonts on the Vogue page, and you can see it's used in the title and the subtitles and the headings. And in general, it gives a very classy and reserved personality to the website. And on the other hand, we have the sans serif font on the Nike website, which gives the website very modern and technical feeling. So another way to differentiate when to use these two different groups of fonts is like how it's used in generally. So the serif fonts is typically found in text-heavy contents. So you'll see them often in like newspapers or essays or really long articles because it's really heavy text friendly. Like it's very easy to read in large quantities. And on the other hand, we have sans serif fonts, which is more for image heavy content. So you'll see that in like websites where they're trying to display a product, and then the text is usually just a description of the product. So moving on to weights. Weights is basically just the boldness of the font. So it's really useful when you're trying to create a hierarchy in your website. And you can think of a hierarchy as blocks. So in this example, the top block is basically where you're going to put the boldest text. And that's pretty much the title or the thing that you want users to focus on the most. And then in the medium section, you're going to use in the middle section, you're going to use a medium weight, and that's basically a subtitle or heading or something that you use to divide sections. And then on the very bottom, we have the light text, which is basically just paragraph text, very dense text. And as a general rule of thumb, you're going to want to use 2 to 3 fonts per website just because you don't want it to be too overwhelming or crowded. And then you don't want to have the font choice distract from like the actual content of the website. So in general, though, don't be too stressed out about the typography because it's not as technical as the coding aspect of designing a website. So sometimes you'll find that when it's perfectly aligned, it's not actually aligned, which sounds really confusing, but I'll explain it in the next few slides. So here, grids are a very common way to align text. And these are just a few ways, these are just a few grid examples, but what differentiates different types of grids is basically like how it's separated as well as where it's used the most. So in the middle for the 12 column, you'll see that used most in like newspapers or like really extensive articles. And then for the 5 column, you'll see that used mostly in posters or like graphics. Yeah. And sometimes you just have to eyeball it. So this is what I was talking about in the previous slide. Basically, sometimes when you auto align it or you align it with grids, it doesn't always turn out perfect because when you were typing the text, sometimes maybe there's like an extra space and it kind of throws it off. And you kind of just want to go through the entire web page and pick out the mistakes. And as long as you like you manually align it afterwards, it should turn out fine. Okay, so it's really useful to pick a font that has a lot of different weights. So here on the left, you can see there's 4 different versions of the same font. And one of these would be a type, and all of them together creates a typeface. So another important thing to consider is line spacing, which is literally like the space between each line. And we recommend using a 1.2 through 1.5 space line spacing in general. And as a rule of thumb, you want to use a larger line spacing for a larger piece of text, just to make it more readable. And for smaller pieces of text, you can use a slightly smaller line space. So here we use 1.2 and 1.5. And then we also have text width, which is basically like the box that you're putting the text in. So typically, it's a lot easier to read text when it's narrower, so your eyes don't have to scan the entire screen. And you can kind of test this out on your own website by like playing with the text width and then seeing like what's the most comfortable for you. We also have contrast. So this kind of ties into next week's lecture on color theory, but this is basically just to show that it's a lot better to use light text on dark backgrounds than dark text on light backgrounds. And yeah, just as an overview, don't stress out too much about typefaces. As long as you kind of consider what we went through on the slides today, like think about hierarchy and blocks, and then try to align it manually, and then think about color contrast, you're gonna be okay. So, okay, so after all of that, how do you actually choose a font? So as I mentioned earlier, it's really useful to start to pick a font that has a typeface. So for this, Google Fonts is going to be very useful. So Google Fonts is probably the most popular option, and it's a great place to start. And then we have typesample.com, which pretty much just has more unique fonts than Google Fonts. Perhaps it has different types of fonts that you didn't see on Google Fonts. And then we also have typewolf.com, which is more of a newsletter format. And this one's really cool because it shows like it's more catered towards branding. So it shows you how you can use these fonts and where you could use them. And it also shows you the most popular fonts that are trending right now. And then WhatFont is actually a Google Chrome extension. And when you activate it and you hover over a certain like area or like a font on a web page, it shows you exactly the size and the color and the font type it is. So yeah, just ultimately there's different styles to communicate through type, and there's many different ways that you can do it. So something we recommend is looking for inspiration from really popular websites or websites that you think are really cool, and perhaps you'll find something that you want to put on your own website. Yeah, this is Korean Google Fonts. So you can use different fonts for different languages on your own website. So that's a really cool thing to implement if you want to have multiple languages on your website. And then this one is for Japanese, I think. But yeah, okay. So I think that is everything. But does anyone have any questions? Okay, so we'll talk to the next one right now.